really our course had three parts, more or less um, divided by each of the midterm exams. Part one was, you can more or less say that we're talking about direct markets and becoming familiar with different kinds of financial assets that there might be there. Part two was about banking and indirect financial markets. And part three was connecting all of this to the macroeconomy, including understanding the role of financial markets in the macroeconomy and understanding how the Fed can use financial markets. I guess one could say that when we looked at indirect financial markets, we noticed that aside from what banks themselves may or may not do, that there's some key links between the banking system and the Fed. And so when we talked about macroeconomics, something that we also spent a lot of talking about was Fed policy and what it should and shouldn't do. So this was mainly before the first midterm. This was mainly between the midterms. And this is mainly what we've been doing since the second midterm. So as I mentioned, you can expect your midterm exam, sorry, your final exam to be mainly about this part, but to also touch upon elements of the others. And that's in two ways. One, a lot of things that came up at the end, of course, are linked to what we studied at the beginning. In other words, the material is cumulative. So things that we did at the end wouldn't make much sense if you hadn't retained what we did at the beginning. An example of that might be that towards the end, remember we were saying that the textbook thinks that the main way in which Fed policy works is because it helps minimize financial frictions. So those financial frictions, in the view of the textbook, are mainly due to adverse selection. I guess asymmetric information more broadly. And of course, that means that to understand what we're doing at the end, we need to remember the concepts that we discussed at the beginning. Okay? So each part involved going through three things, I guess. One, first, we would always start with definitions. So, for example, in the first part, we had to discuss what are direct financial markets, what are the different kinds of assets that are out there, and that was the first one. Second, in each case, maybe a little less so in this example, we might have to learn some formula. I'm going to write formula. And computations related to our understanding of each part. What was that in the first case? In the first case, the most important formula is probably the present value formula. So you have to keep remembering that. It should be pretty straightforward. Let's see, what else did we learn? We also did, when we were talking about direct financial markets, we talked about purchasing power parity and interest rate parity, so you may have to do some computations related to that. In the second part, all our computations had to do with manipulating balance sheets. So what does that mean? It means that you should probably review the balance sheet worksheet that's under exams. That would be important because you may be asked to do some computations with balance sheets. And in the third part, we didn't actually, I don't remember doing any computations, did we? I didn't think so. We could have, right, if you, because remember, in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, this is expected inflation, and if the demand curve moves over here, then you get a different level of inflation. These could have been actual numbers, right? If we knew what the formula were for these curves, if we knew how far they moved and stuff, then these could have been actual numbers. We didn't do that. We could have, but we were more focused on concepts than on doing computations at the end, so that's fine. And the third thing we did whenever we came up with any topic was we came up with some kind of theory, which was usually something to do with demand and supply. In the first part, we were thinking about the factors that might be involved in the determination of various asset prices. The one we spent the most time on was let me see. Well, we talked about different factors that might affect the prices of various bonds or shares, but the thing that we spent the most time on was the yield curve, remember? And in the background there, of course, we have to have the demand and supply that we discussed before. If long-term rates tend to be higher, it must be that there's something that's not nice about them, which is that they're riskier, they're more exposed to interest rate risk. Right? Then we, so a lot of those things were about what kind of factors affect bond prices, and thus interest rates are interesting in their own right. But at the same time, we're also building up to this understanding of the yield curve. So that was one of the major products, let's say, of the first part of this class, understanding yield curves. And again, if you're unsure about any of that, there's the yield curve worksheet that you can go through, which you may have noticed has questions that were in the style of yield curve questions from your first midterm. Okay. Let's see. When we're talking about indirect financial markets, the most important theory that we came up with was the demand and supply for reserves. And while on intuitive level, the idea was that there's some demand for reserves among the banks. The supply, on the other hand, is given by the Fed. But in addition, the Fed can always lend as much as it wishes at the discount rate. And there's also a floor here on the federal funds rate, because the banks will never lend to each other at anything below the rate that they can earn by just leaving the reserves on their balance sheets. So this was the main theoretical innovation from part 2. Now, from part 3, I already drew it. The main theoretical innovation from part 3 is precisely this demand and supply, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Oops, what happened there? Again, one thing I would suggest when you're working through the exam is that, so when we were in person, I would always suggest that whenever you come across a question that has to do with let's say this particular model or any of the other ones, you can sketch this out pretty quickly, right? And then if something comes along and says, what happens if demand increases? Well, in your little sketch, okay, of course your sketch should be labeled so you don't get lost, but if something increases demand and asks you what happens, then you can say, okay, let me just draw it. I can see immediately that GDP increases and inflation increases. If it's a supply shock, let's say is a negative demand shock, I have my sketch here. I can really quickly just see what it does, right? The negative supply shock increases inflation and lowers GDP. So it should be, so you've seen that, okay, this is a little sloppy. I didn't use a ruler, but you've seen that you can sketch out this very quickly if needed, and you should be able to do that. Of course, this is what's going to come up. Now, as I mentioned, the bulk of the midterm, sorry, of the final is going to be about this. So, but for each of these three things, you should make sure to remember the key definitions, the key formulae, and the key theories that we reviewed at the time. At least. Okay? Any questions or comments about the big picture for what we've done and what you need to be able to do on the midterm? Sorry, on the final. I see there are 18 people in the classroom. That's encouraging. I'm glad that you're all diligently attending class and trying to do your best, trying to prepare as best you can for the final. If no questions about those broad things, then I guess the logical next thing is to focus the rest of the review session on the last part. And the last part was the macroeconomic implications of everything we discussed earlier. And as discussed, you will need to do two things for this. One is that you should be familiar with the figure that I just sketched out. You should be able to draw it yourself. So first, of course, you need to be able to remember what's on the axes. Second, you may need to justify the shapes of the curves. So, okay, we always draw demand curves sloping down, but you need to be able to explain why it might do that. Okay? And the leading reason is going to be that if inflation is higher than you anticipated, it erodes the real value of your savings. Fair enough. That's the first part. Also remember, at the end, we looked at a modification of the demand curve, which you probably won't need for anything, for most problems involving the demand curve. But remember, towards the end, we discussed this idea that there could be this alternative demand curve if we take into account the fact that there is this zero lower bound to nominal interest rates. And the Fed can't push interest rates much below zero because then what's the point of holding any assets that pay interest when the interest rate is negative? You might as well just hold cash. And remember, the zero lower bound is represented by this demand curve having a kink there, below which low inflation actually is making matters worse. Because of debt deflation, that was one argument. The other one was because, again, any inflation below that means higher interest rates, which also means eventually that people will default. Okay, so remember that variation if you see any questions related to the zero lower bound. Okay, so that's just the demand curve. Then there's the supply curve. There is the long-run supply curve, where inflation doesn't really matter. And this is how the text draws it. I've told you several times that I think that doesn't capture the fact that high inflation is just harmful. But let's just go with this. And then there's the short-run supply curve, which also slopes up. And these generally cross here at the level of expected inflation. Okay. I say usually because, again, we were discussing that it is rare, but also possible for the supply curve to not be crossing at the rate of expected inflation if there is this supply shock, which generally means an increase in costs. But in the absence of supply shocks, the supply curve crosses here at the level of expected inflation. Okay? So the first thing you need to remember is to justify their shapes. You may be asked about that. And the next thing you need to worry about are shifters, things that might move one or other of these lines. The list for the demand curve is very long, right? So the way to think about the demand curve and what might shift it is to remember that the demand curve is made up by this. And so if you remember this identity, then figuring out what might shift the demand curve comes down to anything that might affect any of these components of aggregate demand. So then taxes, transfers, expectations of the future, your wealth, the ease of borrowing, which has two parts, interest rates and financial frictions, government spending, income abroad, which might affect exports, and the exchange rate. Should I write that out? Why not? Since we're here. Taxes, transfers. Someone has said something in the chat. The chat says, yes, please. All right. Sir, you are served. Transfers, value of savings or wealth, it's the same thing. Expected future income, since you have to borrow against it. I said ease of borrowing, which of course has two parts, interest rates. Oops, that's too small, I think. Interest rates and financial frictions. The latter, of course, is something the textbook emphasizes a lot. Let me write the word borrowing again. I can hardly read it. Sorry about that. Ease of borrowing. Government spending. We don't have an analysis of what changes government spending. We're just saying, okay, politicians determine that, and we're just worried about the the impact that government spending has. And what affects net exports? Well, anything that affects demand for exports, which probably means income abroad, right? If the United States falls into recession, it's going to lower its demand for exports from other countries, and so they may go into recession as well. And the exchange rate. Now, a lot of these things are affected by the government, or rather are So many of these things are just economic variables that are determined by the behavior of millions and millions of people, but some of these are under someone's control. Like government spending is under the control of politicians, and so that means that by changing government spending, you could actually on purpose try and move these things, for better or for worse. And here we have the interest rates, and according to the textbook, the financial fictions, both of which are also under the control of someone, not the government, but the Fed, which is what opens the door for there to be such a thing as macroeconomic policy. So that's for the demand curve. Let me save this before I accidentally do something again. That's the demand curve. The shifters for the supply curve, oops, that's a shorter list. Sorry, trying to clear this up. It's saved, so you can refer to this later. So for the supply curve, the shifters are different. One thing that could shift the supply curve, obviously, is this. If expected inflation changes, the supply curve will shift. Why might the expected inflation change? There are two possible reasons. One is because you have seen that maybe you expected some level of inflation, but for years and years you've seen something else, and so you realize that whatever came into your expectations must be wrong. And the other possibility is that you hear news that you rationally figure out means there would be higher inflation. And that's the idea that these expectations are based on rational expectations. This idea of rational expectations is probably one of the most powerful ideas in macroeconomics, and it underlines all the things that, all these concepts that we talked about at the end that had to do with policy, like timing consistency, the Lucas critique, the idea of having a nominal anchor. All of it comes out of here. Okay? It's the sort of, it's even referred to as the rational expectations revolution. It's sort of a counter to the idea of there just being a fixed Phillips curve out there. It's just a menu of policy options that people pick from. Rational expectations, this idea tells us that's not true. If you adopt a certain policy, it may affect inflationary expectations, and if it does, then the impact is going to be different. Okay? And the other idea, the text just calls it supply shocks as the other possible shifter here. You may recall I've been calling them cost shocks because, well, what is the supply curve if you're thinking at the level of, let's say, a firm, one firm? It's just the marginal cost curve. So this is kind of, you could imagine, just adding up all the cost curves of all the firms. So what's going to make this thing move around? Changes in costs. So if there's a significant change in the cost of some particular input, that's going to move this. We generally don't worry about positive supply shocks because sadly they don't seem to happen much, but negative supply shocks do happen sometimes. That's the only case where you might have a supply curve that is not exactly crossing the long run at the level of expected inflation. Of course, if this cost shock persists for a long time, then this inflation is no longer going to be a surprise. The people will rationally figure that out, and expected inflation would eventually adapt. Okay, So those are the shifters for these curves. And then the last discussion we had after discussing what the shifters are was policy. Whoops. So our discussion of policy had two parts. One was just the maybe a simpler one where we just discussed what should the Fed do in different situations. Right? In this situation, when there's been a negative demand shock, well, recessions aren't good, and so the Fed should lower interest rates to try and push the demand curve back. Towards the end, we also discussed a second reason why a shifting demand curve was a problem, because if the Fed doesn't do anything, expected inflation could drop, and that's what brings up our discussion of this zero lower bound thing. If inflation is low enough, you can end up in a situation where actually the demand curve is sloping the wrong way. If the aggregate demand curve is over here, well, that's not great, because if something isn't done, if this demand curve stays there, then eventually people will expect higher inflation, and we know we don't want to have expected inflation being too high because it causes actual inflation. So the Fed should push back by raising rates. And then the first complication that we came across is, how should the Fed respond to something like this, a supply shock? And as we discussed, there's no easy answer, but one approach, which would be to fight the recession, is going to have the effect of reinforcing any inflation that was unexpected, thus meaning that people would expect higher inflation in the future, which is what happened in the 70s. That's viewed as undesirable. The alternative would be to cut rates. Then you would be making the recession, sorry, not to cut rates, to raise rates to fight the inflation, to cut inflation, that's what I meant to say. And that's going to hurt now. But really, I think most macroeconomists probably think that's the better choice, just because if you give in to the inflation, then later you'll have to cut rates anyway and maybe cause an even larger recession to try and bring inflation under control. Okay. That was the first part of our policy discussion, which focused on what to do in different situations. Then at the end, we had our more maybe abstract discussion, which again brought in the idea of rational expectations to think about policy. And it had to do mainly with the idea of time consistency. And the problem with time consistency had to do with the, I guess it's easiest to see in the case of supply shocks. Actually, in the case of both. In the case of a supply shock, what macroeconomists tend to think is the right thing to do, which is to try and keep expected inflation under control, is clearly not going to be popular. So there may be pressure from the people not to do the right thing, if we interpret this that I just drew as being the right thing, to raise rates to fight the inflation rather than lowering rates to fight the recession. And in particular, we were discussing towards the end, the Fed may be under political pressure not to do that. And the other problem of time consistency, again regarding high inflation, is that one way in which this could happen is if the Fed does it on purpose, right? To the extent that the Fed is, as we were discussing, under the control of the government, they may be tempted to do this just before an election to argue, look what a great job we're doing, look, the economy is growing. And in both cases, that means that what we would like the Fed to do may not actually be time consistent. So that brought two possible solutions. One was the idea of using rules in policy versus discretion. And we also discussed the idea of constrained discretion, which is probably what the Fed does. And the other was this discussion of independence of the Fed from political interference. Because the data do suggest that central banks that are independent not only seem to deliver lower inflation on average, but they also seem to deliver more stable macroeconomies on average, at least in the data that we looked at. Okay, so that's what we did so far. Jean writes, are time consistency and time inconsistency the same? Well, they're the opposite of each other, right? The idea is that some things are not time consistent. Something that's time consistent if you can credibly commit to doing it. Something is not time consistent if your future self will go against it. So like, I want my kids to eat healthy food. But then if we're at the zoo and all the other kids have an ice cream, I'll give in and I'll actually go and buy them one. That's an example. There's a lot of time inconsistency in parenting. So it's referred to as the time consistency problem. And the problem is that many things that are desirable are not time consistent or are time inconsistent. Okay? Because, and again, the idea is that you may want to do something now, but your future self will not go along with it. And so what do you need to do? You need to tie your hands somehow. So your future self can't do the naughty thing, whatever it is. In this case, inflate. One way to constrain yourself is to have a monetary policy that just follows a rule, right? Although we discussed that that has its own risks, because the rule you picked may not work in certain circumstances. And the other, ironically, is independence, because it's what it seems to suggest is that the economists who run the Fed or all the other central banks do their best when they are not under pressure from politicians. The politicians are supposed to be the representatives of the people, but I guess based on our discussion, let's face this as economists. The politicians are doing what's in their own best interest, just like everyone else are trying to maximize something, whether it's profits or fame or political power. And so the immediate implication of that is that they want to remain in office, whoever they are, whether they're good-hearted or not. And that means that they would use all the levers of power to stay in place. And one of them could be the use of monetary policy. And when they can't do that, monetary policy seems to work better. That's what seems to be the case. Sad but true. People are people. So any questions about this, about how the financial system fits into the macroeconomy? Actually, one thing is that connects from this part of the class to the previous one that you'll need to remember is that, remember, suppose the Fed wants to lower interest rates. You do need to remember how the Fed would do that, right? The Fed would lower interest rates by buying bonds or lending to banks or both, right? And so you need to remember, therefore, anytime the Fed does something here, there's correspondingly going to be something happening in the market for reserves that you may need to keep in mind. Okay, so when any monetary policy action has a macroeconomic implication here, and is going to have an impact on the interbank financial transactions. All right. Any questions or comments about any of the details here? We still have plenty of time, so we can do that. If there really aren't any questions or comments, I did prepare an exit quiz for today, which is made up of a selection from of the recent ones. So, are there no more questions or comments? Yes, Jean.
Could we go over one way this aggregate demand and supply graph would change the graph for reserves?
Oh, I see. Sure. So that's not a bad idea. So suppose this is just the usual situation when the Fed acts, right? There's a negative demand shock and the Fed wants to push it back. So we would want the Fed in this case to lower interest rates, right? So let's do this. So let me write out what the situation is. That makes more sense. So there, sorry. Looks pretty though. Negative demand shock. That's the demand curve moving. Fed should lower rates to push it back. And then now Gene's question is, what happens in the market for reserves? Well, in order to lower rates, what does the Fed do? The Fed is trying to buy assets. Whenever the Fed buys something, it has to pay for it. What does the Fed pay with? Monetary base. And since the Fed is dealing with banks, most of the time, that means reserves. Well, actually, if they give cash to the banks, that's still reserves, right? At the bank. So here is that. So here we have reserves in bazillions of dollars. Here we have the demand for reserves. And here we have the supply. So if this is just a regular common recession as opposed to like these existential crises we've been dealing with since 2008, then the Fed is buying bonds, that's raising reserves. So this number here just goes up. So you have a new supply curve, which is there. And so the equilibrium, well, the way I did it, well, never mind, doesn't matter. The equilibrium federal funds rate would drop from here to, well, wherever it is on the demand curve that the two happen to cross. In this case, I happen to make it move a lot, so it's crossing down here at the interest rate on reserves, but it could have been anywhere else depending on how big, how large the bond purchases of the Fed are. Okay, so that's an example of the two things going on simultaneously. If these were normal times and we were in person, then the kinds of questions I might ask you might involve you drawing this picture and then drawing this one, both related to the same shock. But that format of question doesn't lend itself very well to being online, since I haven't figured out what software I could possibly use to help you quickly and easily write graphs like this and submit them into Blackboard. So instead, you'll have pictures and questions, and maybe you'll need to either, that's why I was saying maybe you'll need to have it next to you so you can sketch out something like this if needed. Okay? I was wondering if you could go over a couple of things from the list of channels of monetary policy from the lecture on Monday. And you could go over the balance sheets effects again, a little more detail on the cash flows of firms. So you don't need to have memorized all those lists. I guess the main thing, well, I'm looking for my list. I may have already recycled it because my desk piles up. But broadly, I would say the channels of monetary policy come in 3 bags. One is interest rate effects. So things that somehow or other affect the cost of borrowing. Wealth effects. These things don't affect the cost of borrowing. What they do is they increase people's wealth over what it would have been, thus enabling them to spend more. Let's say, and of course they're related, right? If the interest rate effect makes it cheaper to borrow, it might make the stock market rise because it's cheaper to borrow for the firms. The stock market rises. If I own shares, I am now wealthier. Right? So this one could then cause this additional effect. And then the third, I guess, are what are called the balance sheet effects. And the way they work is a little different, right? The balance sheet effects are due to 2 things. One is the idea that either one of these makes firms better off, right? By better off, I mean they're more profitable, thus they're at less risk of failing. They have more bank capital on their balance sheets as a result. And a key idea that comes out of our discussion of crises was that in a crisis situation, when there are lots of firms or banks or whatever doing badly, adverse selection starts to become a problem. You don't know if your business partner is necessarily at risk of failing, and if you're not sure about that, then you begin to worry, well, if they're so desperate to work with me, mustn't it mean that there's something wrong with them? And then adverse selection sets in. So the idea of the balance sheet effects is that since the firms are healthier, it means there's less reason to worry about transacting with them, which means that financial frictions and adverse selection are mitigated. Okay, so let's see specifically. So I talked about the balance sheet effects broadly. Um, there are several reasons why there are balance sheet effects. Again, one is that if interest rates are lower, then the burden of any loans that you took out as a business or as a household, for that matter, is now lower. So that increases your bank capital. Another balance sheet effect is what you're calling the cash flow effect, which is, well, since we just boosted the economy, there's more business than there would have been, which means the firms are earning more cash than they would have, which also constrains them less. And improves their balance sheet. And again, the key thing here is the reduction in adverse selection and moral hazard. And the same happens to households, right? So imagine I have some contractors out here to fix my roof. They're not going to come here and fix my roof if they're worried that I'm going to not pay them, right? And their concern about whether or not I'm going to pay them is going to be higher if the economy is not doing so well. And so this is my balance sheet as a household or as a person, right? That's the problem here. So it isn't just firms that have balance sheets. So it isn't just firms that have balance sheet effects, and it isn't just firms, it's also households where adverse selection may be a concern. Okay? Good question. Let's see. All right. Anything else? Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Well, if not, then it's time for our final exit quiz. Sad but true. We have now successfully completed the semester. It's been a pleasure, in spite of all the difficulties of online instruction. I've enjoyed interacting with you. And, well, I wish you all the best for the summer. And if you want to discuss econ, anything to do with econ or need some help, I'm always here. And hopefully, well, I'm literally always here sitting at this desk. But I sincerely hope the next semester we won't be here anymore, and we'll be back in in Monroe Hall and back in the dorms. Well, some of you are in the dorms, but back in person. Looking forward to a world where I don't have to greet people by bumping my elbow with them. Let me check quickly, how many people are we? We are 17. Anybody else? Is the last person signing in? No? All right, let's go. First question, suppose we're falling into recession. What might the Fed do to boost demand? And here is a picture of someone falling into recession. That's right, lower interest rates. Very good. Question 2, suppose the federal funds rate is shooting up because of a bank panic. How could the Fed push back? Here is a picture of something shooting up. That's right, increase bond purchases. Very good. What is the credit channel of monetary policy? Forgot to review this one. I guess you could think of this as being one of the wealth effects. Very good. It's about the supply of loans, not about the price, the availability of loans. What happens to monetary policy if we reach the zero lower bound? Does it become useless? Credit channels still work, that's right. Textbook thinks monetary policy works by reducing financial frictions. Is that true? It's interesting that the answers are coming in much faster than usual. Excellent, that's right. That's the main view of the text. All right, 6. The textbook thinks the key friction is asymmetric information. True or false? It is true. That's right. What is the zero lower bound? Is it when the growth rate is 0, when inflation is 0, when real interest rates are 0, or when nominal interest rates are 0? I did mention this today. It is when nominal rates are 0. Very good. That's right. 8. What is so dangerous about the zero lower bound? Is it that fiscal policy doesn't work, or monetary policy doesn't work, or is it high inflation, or is it the self-correcting mechanism makes things worse? Great, the self-correcting mechanism makes things worse. It's good to see most people are getting most things right today. The Phillips curve is a statistical link between what? And here's a picture of a curve. Inflation and unemployment. Very good. The Lucas critique says the impact of policy depends on what? Whether it was expected, exactly. Very good. What does the Fed say its nominal anchor is? Is it following inflation targets, and monetary base targets, money supply targets, or Taylor rule? It's inflation targets. That's right. Very good. What's the link between independence and inflation? The independence of the central bank, of course. This one's from yesterday. They are negatively related, that's right. More independence, lower inflation. Independence and macroeconomic stability, how are they related? They are positively related indeed. What can happen if expected inflation drops too much? Real GDP drops, that's right. Interest rates will be stuck at the zero lower bound. Suppose there is a positive demand shock. Whoops, sorry. If the Fed does nothing, what can happen? Sorry about that. Expected inflation rises. Very good. Right. Suppose there is a positive demand shock. What should the Fed do? Raise interest rates, that's right, to move the demand curve back where it was before. Suppose there is a positive demand shock. How could the Fed raise interest rates? Should they sell bonds, buy bonds, lower the discount rates, or lower the interest rate on reserves? Which of these will achieve the desired goal? They should sell bonds, that's right. Lowering the quantity of reserves would raise the federal funds rate. Suppose there's a negative short-run supply shock. If the Fed does nothing, what might happen? The expected inflation rise or decline, or is it something to do with the monetary base? If the Fed does nothing. Of course, if the Fed does nothing, monetary base won't change. So it must be something to do with inflation. Eventually, the inflation will become expected. 19. Suppose there's a negative short-run supply shock. If the Fed raises rates, what happens? And here, you need to understand what the notation is. So you should remember what pi e means in this context. If the Fed raises rates, then expected inflation doesn't have to change, but the Fed makes the recession worse. Almost there. The short-run aggregate supply curve slopes up because what? When inflation is unexpected, what happens? Wages adjust slowly. The wages adjust with expected inflation, so any surprise in inflation means they do not follow along. And last but not least, 10-year interest rates are rising. What does this suggest? That's right, expected inflation is rising. Let's see what happened. How did we do at the end? Third is Cal. Second is Ben. And number one is Jean. Okay. All right, Jean. So what do you want for our final Snapchat filter of the semester?
Can I let someone else choose today?
All right, who was second? Ben? Any suggestions?
Yeah, could you do, I'm trying to think what animal we haven't done yet. Could you do like a cat? Just a cat?
Just a cat. Let's see. There are several options. Let me see what this one does. Okay, that one doesn't seem to be working. I have this one, which can put a cat on my head.
That's perfect.
And I have this one, which is a little more crazy. All right, everyone. Thanks very much. It's been a great semester. Best of luck for your final exams. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or if necessary, we can arrange a meeting. Meanwhile, take care. All the best for the weekend.